Please welcome Robert Viglione.
All right, so I put the picture in the background here of where I work on a daily basis. This is the University of South Carolina, the International Business School. And you can see with all of the flags we have here in the background that our big focus is the research we do at the university is meant to be global, to have global impact. So that goes from the students that we bring into the school come from all over the world. Oh, yeah, okay, sorry guys. There we go. Yes. So anyway, this is just meant to say that what we do is global, and what I think we're doing with blockchain melds very well with the research that we do at the university and what we're doing here with seasteading. Okay, so here's me. This is the second part of my career. The first part, I was a military officer, and I was building weapon systems for the US government. So the second part of my career, I want to actually do something peaceful and create, and what we're doing here with seasteading is creating, I think, a very bright future for humanity. And I think what we're doing in the open source community is going to mesh very well with that. Okay, so here's me at the tail end of my previous career, and here's me in Afghanistan. I think doing what was the first Bitcoin transaction in Afghanistan in 2013, and I bought a good cigar with it. It was pretty good. It turned out to be very overvalued now with current Bitcoin prices. I spent a lot of money for that cigar, but okay. So I have a few slides here on blockchain and Bitcoin. Not very technical, but I figured it's very important to talk about the what are we talking about? Blockchain is a word or a term that's being thrown around in a lot of different ways, and Bitcoin seems to be this really hot topic that some people love or hate, but I found that a lot of people don't quite understand what the terms mean. So actually, pardon me, I have a different sequence of slides on my laptop here. Okay, so what I meant to say here before was just introducing myself a little bit. Sorry, terrible with this public speaking thing. So my research at the university, I think, is very important to what we're doing. So I'm into the crypto finance research right now. And I'm doing asset pricing, and I'm doing peer-to-peer economic systems. And everything we've been talking about in this last week is on decentralized systems that kind of grow from the ground up. And I think that's a very important concept. It's like an evolutionary approach to economics, and that's what we're doing in the Bitcoin blockchain community. So some projects that I'm working on I think are really cool. Well, I'm teaching a class at the university on this topic, which is a first thing for the university. It's actually fairly novel in the US. We have a few courses being taught at universities on the subject. And I'm a co-founder of Zen, which is a nice open source project, doing what we think is going to bring the world together as well, and in kind of a complementary fashion to some of the other crypto projects. Okay, so that's my background. Let's dive into the actual blockchain stuff. Okay, so I'm interested in this because it's revolutionizing finance, and that's what I'm doing my PhD in right now. Now, Bitcoin is revolutionizing currency, so money, the concept of money, and that's a really big deal. But it also has other effects across the industry spectrum. So the way people transmit money across borders, like the remittance industry, I think we're disrupting right now. We're going to disrupt even more. Settlement, asset settlement, we're disrupting. Trade finance, and venture funding. And this is a very interesting concept that we've been talking about for seasteading, because the way that organizations are raising capital is changing significantly. So there's some opportunities here to kind of dig into these markets. Now, Bitcoin was the world's first blockchain. I'll explain what a blockchain is in a moment, but when people talk about Bitcoin, really they think about digital money. So that's what we have here, and the core innovation of that is we're removing middlemen from transactions. In finance, when you think finance, you think Wall Street, you think major banks, these are very, very well capitalized and powerful middlemen. We've now found a way technically to remove them from transactions and bring money and finance to the peer-to-peer domain. Okay, so there are two types of blockchains that people are working on. There are the open source blockchains like I work on, and then banks are also rushing into the space and creating their own private blockchains to do settlement and other things more efficiently. Both have their place. I think both are adding big value. And some of the value actually, I can show you how rapidly the space is changing. I made this slide, I started coming up with the figures about 2 weeks ago. And at the time, the market capitalization for all of these assets was about $30 billion. I just checked before I came up here, and it was $64 billion. So it's more than doubled in about the last 2 to 3 weeks. So you can see how rapidly the space is growing. We've had over $1.5 billion in venture capital funding has gone to Bitcoin startup companies, right? Initial coin offerings, this is the peer-to-peer crowdfunding that's going on in the space, has raised about close to $250 million in 2016, and that's about half of total venture funding, period, in 2016, right? So this is becoming an increasingly more important part of the global financial system that I think people need to be aware of. So that's why I'm here. Now, the technology itself, really, we're just talking about data structures. Okay, we're talking about a database, and we're distributing it across nodes around the world, right? So that's a very resilient thing. And from a computer science perspective, it's very interesting how they solve some technical challenges that existed pre-Bitcoin, and Bitcoin solved those challenges quite elegantly. Ultimately, though, we're just removing third parties from transactions. Okay, so you think distributed database, we can record things. Bitcoin records financial transactions on this distributed database, and it's removing banks from the entire process. So I think that's very important, especially if we're creating decentralized seasteads, decentralized societies, or we're trying to bring the world together. It's amazing to have a system where you don't have to rely on a third party to do transactions. Okay. Blockchains are what we call in computer science immutable. So once something gets onto the blockchain, it is very difficult to change it or remove it. Okay, so these systems are very resistant to censorship, and they are resistant to fraud. So some key characteristics that I think are extremely interesting in finance is that transactions become transparent, and anyone can go and look at this global ledger to verify that something has occurred. Okay, so from a public perspective, this is very interesting because now you can do things like have open and completely transparent, honest accounting systems, land title registrations, right? So resistant to people tampering with these chains. Okay, so in the open blockchain world, we're essentially Uberizing money and Uberizing finance. That's a really cool concept. We're going peer-to-peer around the world, and we're finally starting to do that in finance. The private chains do have a place, and that's why you'll see all the banks creating these consortiums like R3. They're just reducing costs by, their back office operations are becoming more efficient. Now, Bitcoin is a distributed peer-to-peer money. I figured it's pretty important to talk about this one. It's essentially creating a triple entry accounting system where every transaction is recorded in this public ledger, and it solves this double spending problem that we had prior to that with digital currencies, where if I send someone money, how do I prove to the world that I'm also not sending it to someone else? That's really the core of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. It does get a little bit more complex computer science-wise, but a cool thing is that nodes all over the world store full copies of the chain, so it's very secure system when you have a globally distributed collection of nodes storing data. Okay, now as an economist, what I find extremely interesting about cryptocurrencies is that it is an experiment in managing money that we don't have anywhere else in the world. So we have a full supply path for Bitcoin. This is the Bitcoin supply path. We know from today all the way up until 1,000 years from now or infinity, we know exactly what the Bitcoin supply is going to be. That's a very interesting thing as an economist, because if you're planning your financial future, or you're trying to forecast economic circumstances, you have exactly the supply path that will always exist. There's no ambiguity. The types of things like watching the Federal Reserve Board try to deliberate on tomorrow's interest rate or the money supply, those days are kind of behind us, at least in the cryptocurrency world. Okay, so finance itself is being disrupted in some other additionally interesting ways. So cryptocurrencies represent a new asset class. They're uncorrelated to stocks, bonds, real estate, commodities. So if you're a portfolio manager, you know that you want to have assets that are uncorrelated with each other in order to boost your return per unit risk. So that's what cryptocurrencies now offer the world, is a new asset class. There are a tremendous number of companies out there innovating, like Ripple is changing global bank settlements. BitShares is showing that we can actually do peer-to-peer asset exchange now. So we could remove major stock markets like the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, or at least replicate some of their functions on the blockchain. Companies like BlockPay that I work with, or BitPay, they're actually removing banks from merchant services for payments. Other organizations like Zcash, Monero, Dash, or my organization Zen, Zclassic as well, are anonymizing digital transactions to provide more financial privacy. Ethereum is decentralizing contracts. So there's just a lot going on in the space. And then we have things like ICOs, these initial coin offerings or initial token offerings that are generating millions of dollars for startups around the world by going directly to these peer-to-peer crowdfunding markets. So just some examples. We have the Dow raised $160 million. That was actually kind of a disaster for those of you who know the news of the Dow. But other organizations like Ethereum, Waves, and others are raising tens of millions of dollars for their startups in a decentralized fashion without going to venture capital. Okay, so the important stuff for us, or the good stuff, is how does this apply to seasteading? Well, I think that the open source software ethos, the community, is extremely symbiotic with seasteading. Okay, and that starts with our concept of radical inclusion. So that's how we do everything in open source software. We're completely inclusive to anyone in the world, and we try to foster innovation at an accelerating rate by having permissionless innovation. We generally subscribe to the concepts of voluntarism. Everything's participatory. Anyone's free to join or leave at their will. And you'll find that people in this space really care about social welfare. There are so many different social entrepreneurship projects that are going on right now where we're trying to make the world better. We're trying to do it through software, but I think that the real opportunities are in melding the software communities to those like seasteading that are building real platforms and making the world better. Okay, so my time's coming to an end shortly. I'll hurry this up. We're also experimenting with decentralized governance and software. Cryptocurrencies are ubiquitous. They don't recognize international borders. They could be used by anyone, anywhere. ICOs are a really important new way to raise capital I think we should be aware of. We can do things like property title registration or identity management on blockchains. These are also interesting concepts, I think, for seasteading. And then it just gives fundamentally access to global capital markets in ways that are not easily done through traditional finance mechanisms. Okay, but opportunities for French Polynesia, maybe even the most important aspect here is we have the opportunity to be early adopters of the technology. So it's something that is exploding rapidly around the world, especially in the US financial system. There's a lot of capital and a lot of very intelligent people innovating in this space. And I think it would be great to leverage that, human capital and effort here in French Polynesia. And seasteading is a great way to introduce that potentially. For me in academia, I would love to see educational partnerships. I teach this stuff, and I know other people are doing very innovative educational training programs with computer science, programming, teaching people blockchain, doing peer-to-peer fintech work. I think having a pipeline from academia to industry, especially global industry, could be a very important contribution that we could offer seasteading in French Polynesia. And just this technology has huge impact in the financial industry. So the fintech startup, seeing that we could potentially evolve here would be another attractive aspect of it. And just in general, I think that all of this could lead to a nice diversification of the local economy if we could actually get things started in this direction. So anyway, that's all I had. I'll leave you guys with some quotes. Peter Thiel, this was a really interesting one because Peter Thiel has been involved with the Seasteading Institute. And he has been quoted as saying, I do think Bitcoin is the first encrypted money that has the potential to do something like change the world. I completely agree. So it's great that we're starting this conversation and having it now here. Another one, Leon Luo, pardon my pronunciation, Nobel Peace Prize nominee. He said that every informed person needs to know about Bitcoin because it might be one of the world's most important developments. I completely agree with this, and I think that this is opening the gateway for us to really make the world more inclusive and bring people that have been previously disenfranchised from traditional banking and finance into the global fold. So that's what I have.